Alex Miller moved quickly through the crowded streets of Seattle, his mind a storm of thoughts as he rehearsed answers for the interview that could change his life. Every step felt calculated, a move on a mental chessboard aimed at arriving on time at TechWave, the company where he dreamed of building his future. Fresh out of college with a degree in software engineering, this interview was his first real test. He wasn't going to blow it. As he neared a busy crosswalk, something unexpected pulled him from his focused march. An elderly woman stood at the edge of the sidewalk, her white hair disheveled and a stubborn umbrella twisting awkwardly in her grip. The flow of the crowd moved around her, indifferent to her struggle, and she hesitated, glancing nervously at the cars rushing past. Alex hesitated too, just for a moment. He glanced at his watch. 8:40, 20 minutes until the interview. He could just keep walking and no one would judge him. But something tugged at him, a small, insistent voice that wouldn't let him ignore what was happening in front of him. Taking a deep breath, Alex stepped out of the flow of pedestrians and approached her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Do you need help crossing the street?" The woman looked up, startled, her sharp blue-gray eyes meeting his. Her expression softened almost immediately, relief washing over her face. "Oh, young man, that would be wonderful. These crowds and this umbrella, I swear it's plotting against me," she said with a dry chuckle, though her discomfort was evident. Alex smiled, extending his arm. "Here, hold on to me. I'll make sure you get across safely." She hesitated only for a second before slipping her frail hand into the crook of his arm. "You're very kind. Most people just brush past as if I'm invisible," she remarked as they began to cross. "Happy to help," Alex replied sincerely, keeping an eye on the traffic and gently guiding her through the bustling street. As they reached the opposite curb, she let go of his arm, standing a little taller now that the ordeal was over. "Thank you, dear. Truly. What's your name?" "Alex Miller," he answered, extending his hand. She took it with a firm grip that surprised him. "Margaret Johnson," she said, a small, warm smile on her lips. "It's rare to meet someone like you these days, Alex." "I just did what anyone would," Alex said modestly. Margaret's smile deepened and there was something knowing in her expression, though Alex couldn't quite place it. "Don't underestimate the value of a simple act of kindness, Alex," she said, releasing his hand. "Well, I won't keep you. You look like you're in a hurry." "I am, but it was my pleasure to help," he said, stepping back as she nodded in thanks. "Good luck with wherever you're heading," Margaret called out as they parted ways, her voice steady despite the noise of the city. "You too, Mrs. Johnson," Alex replied, before turning and quickening his pace. As he wove back into the stream of pedestrians, his thoughts returned to the upcoming interview, but a lingering sense of warmth remained. It was such a small thing, helping someone cross the street, but it felt meaningful. What Alex couldn't know, what he couldn't have predicted, was that the woman he'd just helped was about to play a pivotal role in his life. But for now, he was just a young man, chasing a dream, blissfully unaware of the storm of events that his kindness had set in motion. The next day, Alex Miller walked into the headquarters of TechWave, his nerves taut with anticipation. The sleek, expansive building towered above the surrounding streets, an embodiment of innovation and success. Each step toward the polished glass doors felt heavy with purpose. Inside, the lobby buzzed with activity. TechWave employees, dressed sharply in business casual attire, moved with an air of efficiency. Alex stood for a moment, his heart pounding as he soaked in the energy of the place. He approached the reception desk and gave his name. "Alex Miller, here for a 9 a.m. interview," he said, keeping his voice steady despite his nerves. The receptionist, a young woman with a friendly smile, typed quickly on her keyboard. "Of course, Mr. Miller. Someone will be down to escort you shortly. Please have a seat." Alex nodded, though he barely sat down before a tall man in a crisp suit appeared. "Mr. Miller, follow me, please," the man said without much ceremony. Alex followed, his palms slightly sweaty as they moved down a gleaming hallway lined with framed awards and accolades showcasing TechWave's accomplishments. He didn't have much time to take it all in before they reached a large conference room. "Wait here," the man said, before stepping aside and holding the door open. Alex walked in, expecting a panel of stern executives, maybe a long table stacked with folders and laptops. Instead, his eyes immediately landed on one person, Margaret Johnson. She sat at the head of the table, her posture poised and commanding. Her silver hair styled neatly, added to the air of wisdom and authority that radiated from her. She wore an elegant blazer, the kind that spoke of quiet confidence rather than ostentation. When she looked up and met Alex's gaze, a slow smile spread across her face. "Alex Miller," she said warmly, leaning back slightly in her chair. "It seems we meet again." Alex froze, disbelief flickering across his face. For a moment, he wondered if he was in the wrong room. "Mrs. Johnson," he finally managed. She tilted her head slightly, amusement in her eyes. "Yes, Alex, although here I'm usually just Margaret." "But do you work here?" he asked, still trying to reconcile the kindly woman he'd helped the day before with the confident figure now sitting before him. Margaret chuckled softly, a sound that managed to be both disarming and deeply self-assured. "Work here? Oh no, Alex, I don't just work here. I founded TechWave." Her words hit Alex like a thunderclap. He blinked, processing the revelation. His mind raced, replaying their brief encounter the day before. The modesty, the genuine gratitude. Nothing about her demeanor had hinted at her status. He stammered, unsure of how to respond. "I didn't realize. Yesterday you was just an old woman trying to cross the street." Margaret finished for him, her eyes sparkling with humor. Sometimes, Alex, the simplest gestures reveal the most about a person. Yesterday I saw someone willing to help a stranger without hesitation, and that told me more about you than any resume ever could. Alex's face flushed. "I just did what felt right," he said, his voice quiet. "And that," Margaret said, leaning forward slightly, "is precisely why you're here." Before Alex could respond, the door swung open abruptly. A man strode in, his presence as commanding as Margaret's, though laced with an edge of impatience. His dark suit was immaculate, his expression sharp, and his eyes flicked to Alex with a dismissive glance before settling on Margaret. "Margaret," he said curtly, ignoring Alex entirely, "we need to address the Westfield accounts. They can't wait." Margaret didn't miss a beat. She raised a hand, her voice calm but firm. "Not now, Richard. I'm in the middle of an interview." Richard Thompson, Alex guessed from the nameplate he'd seen in the lobby, was the CFO. His narrowed eyes betrayed a flicker of annoyance. "This is important," he insisted, his tone barely masking his frustration. "And so is this," Margaret countered, her composure unshaken. "We'll discuss it later." For a moment, Richard seemed ready to argue, but something in Margaret's gaze stopped him. With a clipped nod, he turned on his heel and left the room, closing the door behind him with a bit more force than necessary. Alex shifted uncomfortably, unsure if he should say anything. Margaret noticed and gave him a reassuring smile. "Don't let him intimidate you," she said. "Richard has his strengths, but tact isn't one of them." Alex nodded, though the interaction left him slightly unsettled. "Let's get back to you," Margaret said, her tone softening as she focused her attention fully on Alex. "I've read your resume. Your academic achievements are impressive, and your technical skills are exactly what we're looking for. But honestly, what stood out to me was what I saw yesterday." Alex blinked, surprised. "Yesterday?" "Yes," Margaret said. "Empathy, integrity, the ability to take initiative, those aren't things I can teach. And here at TechWave, those qualities matter as much as technical expertise. So I've decided to skip the formalities. The position is yours if you want it." Alex stared at her, stunned. "You mean you're offering me the job, just like that?" Margaret smiled knowingly. "Just like that. Do you accept?" For a brief moment, Alex hesitated, the weight of the opportunity settling in. Then he nodded, his voice firm. "Yes, I'd be honored to join TechWave." "Good," Margaret said, rising from her chair and extending a hand. "Welcome aboard, Alex." He shook her hand, still feeling a mixture of awe and disbelief. As he left the room, Margaret's words lingered in his mind, filling him with a new sense of determination. But as the door closed behind him, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that his journey at TechWave was only just beginning, and that Richard Thompson's icy glare wasn't the last challenge he would face. Alex's first week at TechWave was a whirlwind of introductions, training sessions, and late nights spent catching up on the company's intricate systems. Despite the intensity, he was invigorated by the dynamic environment. His teammates were welcoming, and the projects he worked on sparked a creativity he hadn't tapped into in years. On his second day, he was introduced to Sarah Williams, a software developer with a sharp mind and a knack for breaking down complex problems into elegant solutions. She had an infectious passion for technology and a quick wit that made her a favorite among the team. "You must be Alex," she said when they met at his desk. "Welcome to the madhouse." "Don't worry, it's the fun kind of madness," Alex smiled. "Thanks, it's a lot to take in, but I'm excited to get started." "Good," she replied. "Excited is the right mindset. We work hard here, but we build some pretty amazing things. If you ever get stuck, I'm happy to help." He quickly found that Sarah was as good as her word, often stopping by to check on him or sharing tips to navigate the company's labyrinthine codebase. Then there was James Anderson, a seasoned analyst whose quiet demeanor concealed a wealth of knowledge about TechWave's inner workings. James had been with the company for over a decade and had seen it grow from a small startup to the powerhouse it was now. "Don't let the pace intimidate you," James said during one of their first conversations. "TechWave moves fast, but it's built on teamwork. You'll find your rhythm soon enough." The supportive atmosphere from Sarah and James was a relief, but not everything about his new role was smooth sailing. Richard Thompson, the CFO, was a looming presence Alex couldn't ignore. From the first day, Richard seemed to have an axe to grind with him. It started subtly, pointed remarks during meetings about Alex's inexperience, a cold indifference to his contributions, but quickly escalated to outright obstruction. One morning, Alex received an email assigning him to a high-priority project. The task was detailed, complex, and critical to the company's success. Excited for the challenge, Alex dove in. But when he approached Richard to clarify some ambiguous parts of the assignment, the man barely looked up from his desk. "You're a smart guy, aren't you? Figure it out," Richard said curtly, waving Alex off without further explanation. Alex swallowed his frustration, determined not to let Richard's dismissiveness shake him. But it wasn't just the lack of support. Richard routinely excluded Alex from meetings related to projects he was directly involved in, forcing him to scramble for updates through second-hand sources. One afternoon, while grabbing coffee in the company's cafe, Alex ran into Sarah and James. They noticed his furrowed brow and slumped shoulders immediately. "You look like you've just been through a war zone," Sarah said, handing him a cup of coffee. "Feels like it," Alex admitted, slumping into a chair. "Richard's making my life miserable. I'm starting to think I did something to offend him before I even started here." Sarah frowned, stirring her drink. "Richard's tough on everyone, but this sounds personal." "He has a reputation," James added cautiously, glancing around to ensure no one was within earshot. "A reputation for what?" Alex asked, leaning in. James hesitated, then said in a low voice, "For being, let's call it morally flexible. There are rumors he's involved in some questionable practices, financial irregularities, backroom deals with suppliers. Nothing proven, but enough whispers to make people nervous." Sarah nodded. "And if he sees you as a threat, or just doesn't like you, he'll find ways to push you out. He's done it before." The weight of their words settled on Alex. It explained a lot about Richard's hostility, but also raised a host of new questions. Was Richard trying to sabotage him because he feared Alex might uncover something? "What should I do?" Alex asked. "Keep your head down for now," James advised. "Focus on your work, but stay alert. If Richard's up to something, he'll slip eventually, and when he does, we'll be ready," Sarah finished, her tone firm. That evening, as Alex worked late at his desk, he couldn't shake the feeling that James and Sarah were right. Richard's behavior wasn't just difficult, it was strategic. The thought both unnerved and motivated him. From that moment on, Alex decided he wouldn't just endure Richard's interference. He would keep his eyes open, observing every interaction, every inconsistency, every crack in the facade. Little did he know, the truths he was about to uncover would plunge him into the heart of a conflict far larger than he imagined. The office was eerily quiet as Alex leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the final lines of a report he'd been piecing together for hours. Most of the staff had gone home, leaving the sprawling TechWave building in near silence, save for the occasional hum of the ventilation system. He stretched his arms, glancing at the clock. It was nearing midnight. Packing his things, Alex stood and stepped into the empty hallway. As he made his way toward the elevator, something caught his attention. A thin line of light seeping under Richard Thompson's office door. He paused. At this hour, most of the executive offices were dark, locked and abandoned until morning. Richard's office being lit was unusual, especially considering the CFO rarely stayed late. Intrigued, Alex walked quietly toward the door, his footsteps barely audible on the polished floor. As he got closer, muffled voices became clearer. Richard was on a call, his voice sharp and commanding. "It needs to be done discreetly," Richard was saying, his tone clipped with irritation. "No deviations, and make sure the numbers don't attract attention." Alex froze in place, heart pounding. He wasn't sure what Richard was talking about, but the tension in the man's voice suggested it wasn't routine business. He leaned closer, careful to stay out of sight. "I don't care what it takes," Richard continued, his frustration bleeding into a dangerous edge. "Just make it happen." A sharp clatter of something on Richard's desk startled Alex. Panicked, he stepped back, ensuring he was out of view before retreating down the hallway as quietly as possible. When he reached the elevator, his mind was racing. What the hell was that about? The next morning, Alex sought out Sarah and James, needing to share what he'd overheard. They met in a quiet corner of the cafeteria during the early rush, choosing a table tucked away from prying ears. "You look like you didn't sleep," Sarah said as Alex sat down. "What's going on?" "I didn't," Alex admitted, leaning in. "I was here late last night and heard something unsettling." James raised an eyebrow. "Unsettling how?" Alex recounted the brief conversation he'd overheard. Sarah and James listened intently, their expressions darkening with every word. "To make sure the numbers don't attract attention," Sarah repeated, her voice laced with concern. "That doesn't sound innocent." "No, it doesn't," Alex agreed, and the way he said it, it wasn't just business frustration. It felt calculated. James frowned, folding his arms. "If Richard's covering something up, this could be huge, but we can't act on a hunch. We need proof." Sarah nodded. "Without hard evidence, it's just your word against his. And Richard knows how to protect himself." Alex sighed, running a hand through his hair. "So how do we find proof?" "I might have an idea," Sarah said after a moment. "Emily Davis in marketing has access to financial reports. She could spot any inconsistencies if we loop her in." "And Michael Brown in IT," James added. "He's sharp and discreet. If Richard's been using the company's systems for anything shady, Michael could trace it." Alex hesitated. "Do you think they'll help? This could put them at risk." "Emily's got a sharp moral compass," Sarah replied confidently. "She won't let something like this slide if there's a chance it's harming the company." "And Michael," James added, "has been itching for a chance to take Richard down a peg." Later that day, Alex, Sarah, and James met with Emily and Michael in a small, unused conference room. Emily was a bright-eyed, quick-thinking marketer whose knack for analyzing data was second only to her determination to do the right thing. Michael, on the other hand, was a calm, methodical IT specialist with a dry sense of humor and a reputation for uncovering hidden truths in TechWave's sprawling digital systems. Emily spoke first after hearing Alex's account. "Richard's been untouchable for years," she said, her brow furrowed. "If he's involved in something illegal, this could finally be our chance to expose him." Michael leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I can pull system logs, email trails, and access records. If he's been sloppy, I'll find it." "What about the financial side?" Sarah asked, turning to Emily. "I'll start digging through expense reports and vendor accounts," Emily replied. "If there are discrepancies, they'll show up there." Alex felt a flicker of hope as the team began outlining their plan. "We have to be careful," he reminded them. "If Richard catches wind of this, he won't hesitate to retaliate." "Don't worry," Michael said with a small smirk. "I know how to stay invisible." Over the next week, the group worked covertly to gather evidence. Emily pored over years of financial reports, cross-referencing them with internal records and external vendor accounts. It didn't take long for her to find something suspicious. "This is odd," she told the group during one of their secret meetings. "There's a pattern of payments to a consulting firm that doesn't seem to exist. The name shows up on invoices, but there's no contact information, no website, nothing." Michael added to the findings, "And I found an encrypted email thread on Richard's account. It's heavily secured, but I managed to decode a few snippets. He's coordinating with someone outside the company, and they're definitely hiding something." "What did the email say?" Alex asked. "Enough to confirm that this isn't just financial mismanagement. It's intentional," Michael replied. "Whatever Richard's doing, it's deliberate and dangerous." By the end of the week, The team had uncovered enough irregularities to paint a troubling picture. Richard wasn't just bending the rules, he was actively exploiting TechWave for personal gain. As they prepared to present their findings to Margaret, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the tip of the iceberg. There was more to Richard's schemes than they had uncovered, and exposing him was bound to provoke a reaction. Whatever came next, Alex knew they were crossing a line from which there was no return. The days following their investigation were fraught with tension. Richard Thompson, TechWave's calculating CFO, seemed to sense the shift in the air. He became more aggressive, his hostility toward Alex escalating with every passing interaction. In a department-wide meeting one morning, Richard seized the opportunity to humiliate Alex in front of his peers. "Mr. Miller," Richard said, cutting Alex off mid-presentation, "perhaps it's time to reconsider whether this role suits you. Your performance doesn't exactly inspire confidence." Alex paused, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He could hear the faint shuffle of papers, the coughs of a few uneasy colleagues. His grip on the presentation remote tightened, but he forced himself to remain composed. "With all due respect, Mr. Thompson," Alex replied, his voice calm but edged with defiance, "I take pride in doing my job with integrity. Unfortunately, I can't say the same for everyone in this room." The room fell silent. Sarah, sitting a few chairs away, widened her eyes, but bit her lip to suppress a smile. James tilted his head slightly, impressed by Alex's boldness. Richard's face darkened, his lips pressed into a thin line, and his piercing gaze locked onto Alex like a predator sizing up its prey. He leaned back in his chair, his tone icy. "Careful, Miller. Words like that can have consequences." The meeting moved on, but the tension lingered. Alex knew he'd crossed a line, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Richard's public attacks were becoming unbearable, and his conscience wouldn't let him sit silently any longer. That evening, Alex joined Sarah, James, Emily, and Michael in one of the smaller conference rooms they had adopted as their unofficial headquarters. The atmosphere was charged with urgency. "We can't let this drag on any longer," Alex said, pacing the room. "Richard knows something's up, and if we wait too long, he'll find a way to cover his tracks." "He's already starting to tighten his grip," Sarah added, tapping a pen against the table. "He's excluding us from meetings, cutting off access to key data. If we don't act now, we'll lose our window." Emily nodded. "We've got enough evidence to make a case. Financial irregularities, encrypted communications, and those mysterious vendor accounts, it's all there." "But is it enough?" Michael asked, his arms crossed. "Richard's a master manipulator. If we go to Margaret without a watertight case, he'll twist the narrative and make us look like fools." James, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. "I think we have to risk it. Margaret's no fool. If we show her what we've found, she'll know what to do." The group exchanged glances. They all knew the risks. Confronting someone as powerful as Richard could have serious consequences, but doing nothing felt worse. "Let's do it," Alex said firmly. The next day, Alex and his team requested a private meeting with Margaret. She agreed, setting aside time in her personal office, a place few employees ever entered. The group arrived together, a united front, carrying printed reports, spreadsheets, and digital files stored securely on a flash drive. Margaret sat at her desk, her expression unreadable but attentive. "Come in," she said, gesturing to the chairs in front of her desk. "You have my attention." Alex took a deep breath and began. "Mrs. Johnson, we've uncovered some troubling information about Richard Thompson. We believe he's been engaging in unethical and possibly illegal activities that jeopardize the integrity of TechWave." Margaret didn't interrupt as Alex spoke, her sharp blue-gray eyes scanning the documents they handed her. Sarah and Emily provided detailed explanations of the financial anomalies, while Michael described the encrypted communications and suspicious activity logs. Margaret's expression remained neutral, but her silence carried weight. She flipped through the papers methodically, pausing occasionally to take notes. When they finished presenting, the room was still. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her hands steepled under her chin. "I've always trusted my instincts," she said finally, her voice low but steady. "And my instincts have told me for some time that Richard might be hiding something." She looked directly at Alex. "You've done well to bring this to me. It couldn't have been easy." Alex nodded, his heart pounding. "We couldn't ignore it. Richard's behavior has been alarming, and these findings speak for themselves." Margaret sighed. a hint of weariness in her expression. Richard has been with TechWave for years. He's clever, ambitious, and knows this company inside and out. That makes him both an asset and a liability. If what you've uncovered is true, we're dealing with a serious breach of trust. James spoke up. Do you think the board will support action against him? Margaret's eyes flicked to James, her jaw tightening slightly. The board will do what's right for the company. And I will ensure that Richard is held accountable, but we must proceed carefully. He won't go down without a fight. Her words carried a sense of finality, but also an undercurrent of determination. Leave the evidence with me, Margaret continued. I'll review it thoroughly and take the necessary steps. In the meantime, stay vigilant and keep this between us. The fewer people who know, the better. As they left her office, Alex felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Margaret had taken them seriously, but the road ahead was fraught with uncertainty. You think she'll act quickly? Sarah asked as they walked back to the conference room. She has to, Alex replied, but something tells me this is far from over. He was right. The confrontation with Richard was only the beginning, and the fallout from their decision to act would set in motion events none of them could foresee. The day after their meeting with Margaret, a tense atmosphere enveloped TechWave. Conversations that once flowed freely now felt guarded, and employees moved through the halls with a heightened awareness, as if everyone sensed a storm brewing. Margaret had assured Alex and his team that she would take action, but she had also warned them about Richard's cunning. Richard, for his part, seemed to transform overnight. His usual aloof demeanor was replaced with an unnerving vigilance. He began summoning employees for unscheduled meetings, meticulously reviewing past contracts, and making pointed inquiries into projects he had previously ignored. In the break room that afternoon, Sarah found Alex leaning against the counter, staring into his coffee mug. He knows, Sarah said without preamble. Alex looked up sharply. What do you mean? He's acting like someone hunting for a mole, she replied, glancing around to make sure they were alone. He's asking all kinds of questions about who's working on what, cross-referencing departments. It's like he's trying to figure out if anyone's turned on him. Alex sighed, running a hand through his hair. Margaret said she'd handle it. But if Richard figures it out first, he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Sarah leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. If he finds out it's us, Alex, you know he won't just sit back. We're talking about someone who spent years covering his tracks. He'll come after us. Alex nodded grimly. We just have to trust Margaret. She knows what's at stake. But trusting Margaret didn't make the unease go away. By late afternoon, Alex's focus was shredded. He sat at his desk, staring at his screen but absorbing nothing. Then, an email notification popped up in the corner of his monitor. Subject: Immediate meeting request from Richard Thompson, Mr. Miller, please report to my office immediately. Richard Thompson. The words hit Alex like a gut punch. He took a deep breath, trying to suppress the panic rising in his chest. His eyes darted toward Sarah's desk, but she was on a call, her back turned to him. There was no time to consult anyone. He stood smoothing the front of his shirt and made his way to Richard's office. The walk down the hallway felt endless. When he arrived, the door was slightly ajar. Come in, Richard's voice called from inside, calm but edged with something Alex couldn't quite place. Alex pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. Richard was seated behind his desk, his chair slightly turned as he looked out the window. Slowly, he swiveled to face Alex, a cold smile spreading across his face. Sit down, Alex, Richard said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Alex obeyed, keeping his posture relaxed despite the tension in the room. How can I help you, Mr. Thompson? He asked evenly. Richard leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, fingers steepled. I've noticed you've been busy lately, he began, his voice smooth but laced with an undercurrent of menace. Perhaps busier than your position requires. Alex blinked, keeping his expression neutral. I'm committed to my work, sir. I always strive to go above and beyond. Richard's lips curled into a faint smirk. Indeed, but there's a fine line between dedication and curiosity. And curiosity, Alex, can be dangerous in the wrong context. Alex's heart pounded, but he forced himself to maintain eye contact. I'm not sure I follow. Richard let out a short, humorless laugh, sitting back in his chair. Oh, I think you do. Let me give you some advice, Mr. Miller. Focus on your tasks, stay in your lane. Leave the important matters to those who are equipped to handle them. Alex tilted his head slightly, as if considering Richard's words. With all due respect, sir, I'm here to contribute to the company's success. I assumed that meant taking initiative when necessary. Richard's eyes narrowed, the smile disappearing from his face. He leaned forward again, the space between them feeling charged. You're young, ambitious, I get it. But ambition without discipline is a liability. Don't make yourself one. The threat hung in the air like a blade. Alex's mind raced, but he refused to let the silence intimidate him. I understand your concern, Alex said finally, his tone steady, but I assure you everything I do is for the good of TechWave. Richard's gaze lingered on Alex for a moment longer, before he stood abruptly, signaling the end of the conversation. Good. Let's keep it that way. Alex rose from his seat, giving a polite nod before turning to leave. As he reached the door, Richard's voice stopped him. Oh, and Alex. He turned back, one hand on the doorframe. Be careful. The higher you climb, the harder the fall. Alex said nothing, closing the door behind him as he left. Back at his desk, Alex struggled to focus. The encounter with Richard played on a loop in his mind, every word dissected for hidden meanings. It was clear now. Richard suspected him. When Sarah returned from her call, Alex pulled her aside. He knows, Alex said quietly. He didn't say it outright, but he knows someone's onto him, and I think he suspects me. Sarah's face hardened. Then we don't have much time. Margaret has to act now before Richard does something drastic. Alex nodded. I'll update her tonight. But whatever happens next, we need to be ready for anything. What Alex didn't know was that Richard had already begun laying the groundwork for his counterattack, and the stakes were about to get much higher. Alex couldn't shake the weight of his confrontation with Richard. The man's veiled threats lingered in his mind, but they didn't deter him. Instead, they fueled his resolve. He needed to see this through, not just for himself, but for everyone at TechWave who deserved better leadership. Later that evening, he met with Sarah, James, and Emily in their usual spot, the small, tucked-away conference room they had claimed for their secret meetings. The door clicked shut, and Alex wasted no time recounting what had transpired in Richard's office. He knows we're onto him, Alex said, his voice low but firm. He didn't come right out and say it, but it was clear. He's trying to intimidate me into backing off. Sarah crossed her arms, her expression darkening. Which means we don't have time to wait. If Margaret doesn't act soon, Richard's going to bury us, and the evidence with him. Or worse, Emily added, glancing nervously at the door. If he has allies, they could help him spin this into something that makes us look like the problem. James nodded in agreement. The longer we stay in the shadows, the more vulnerable we are. Margaret needs to move, and fast. Alex leaned forward, his voice steady but urgent. I'll talk to her tonight. She needs to know how critical this is. The next morning, Alex received a message from Margaret summoning him to her office. When he arrived, he found her seated behind her desk, reviewing a stack of documents. She looked up as he entered, gesturing for him to take a seat. Alex, she began, her tone even but purposeful, I've reviewed everything you and your team uncovered. There's no question Richard has been exploiting this company for his own gain. Alex nodded, waiting for her to continue. That said, Margaret added, leaning back in her chair, this isn't a simple matter. Richard is deeply entrenched here. He's built alliances over the years, some within the executive board itself. Taking him down won't be straightforward. Alex frowned. I think some of the board members will defend him. Margaret sighed, folding her hands on the desk. I know they will. Richard is cunning. He's done favors, made deals, and gathered leverage over time. Some of them owe him, others fear him. If we're not careful, they'll use their influence to protect him and turn the focus back on us. So what's the plan? Alex asked. Margaret leaned forward, her gaze sharp. I've called for an executive board meeting tomorrow. I'm presenting the evidence directly to them, with no opportunity for Richard to spin the narrative beforehand. Alex's pulse quickened. That's bold. Do you think they'll listen? They'll have no choice, Margaret said firmly. The evidence is too compelling. But I need you there, Alex. His brows furrowed. Me? Margaret nodded. Your role in uncovering this is crucial. If Richard tries to discredit the investigation, your testimony will add weight to our case. The board needs to hear from someone directly involved. Alex hesitated, the gravity of her words sinking in. Confronting Richard in a private office was one thing. Facing him in a room full of powerful executives, was another. Margaret must have sensed his hesitation because her tone softened. "I know it's asking a lot, Alex, but this isn't just about Richard. It's about protecting everything we've built here. You've shown courage and integrity throughout this. I believe in you." Alex met her gaze, feeling a surge of resolve. "I'll be there," he said. The next day, the tension in the air was palpable as Alex walked into the conference room. The long table was filled with TechWave's top executives, each one representing a pillar of the company's operations. Margaret sat at the head, her calm authority setting the tone. Richard arrived last, his expression carefully neutral, though Alex could see the sharpness in his eyes as they darted around the room. He was scanning, assessing, calculating. "Thank you all for coming," Margaret began, her voice steady but commanding. "I've called this meeting to address a matter of critical importance to the integrity of this company." The executives exchanged glances, curiosity and unease rippling through the group. Richard, however, leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips, as if he already knew where this was heading. "As many of you know," Margaret continued, "TechWave prides itself on transparency and ethical leadership. Unfortunately, we have reason to believe that these principles have been compromised at the highest levels." Richard's smirk faded slightly, his posture stiffening. He glanced briefly at Alex, who kept his face carefully blank. Margaret gestured to the stack of documents in front of her. "In recent weeks, evidence has come to light suggesting financial misconduct involving one of our senior executives. These documents detail irregularities in vendor accounts, encrypted communications, and unauthorized financial transactions." She paused, letting her words settle. The room grew tense as the weight of her statement sank in. "I won't mince words," Margaret said. "This evidence points directly to Richard Thompson." All eyes turned to Richard. For a moment he remained motionless, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned forward, his hands folded on the table. "These are serious accusations, Margaret," he said, his voice calm but laced with indignation. "I trust you have proof to support them?" Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "We do," she said, sliding the documents down the table for the board members to review. Richard glanced at the papers but didn't touch them. "I see," he said slowly, his tone measured. "And may I ask who is responsible for gathering this so-called evidence?" Margaret's eyes flicked to Alex, who took a deep breath before speaking. "I am," Alex said, his voice steady, "along with my colleagues Sarah Williams, Emily Davis, and James Anderson." Richard's gaze sharpened as it locked onto Alex. "How convenient," he said, his smirk returning. "A group of junior employees digging through confidential company records. Tell me, Alex, were you hoping to make a name for yourself by accusing me?" Alex held his ground. "I was doing my job," he replied evenly. "And what we found speaks for itself." The room erupted into murmurs, the tension boiling over. Margaret raised a hand, calling for silence. "This isn't about personal ambitions," she said firmly. "It's about holding ourselves accountable to the standards we claim to uphold." The board members continued to exchange uneasy glances. Richard leaned back in his chair, his smirk replaced by a calculating expression. "This isn't over," he said quietly. His words meant only for Margaret and Alex. Margaret met his gaze, her voice steady. "No, it's not." The meeting concluded with the decision to launch a formal investigation into the evidence. But as Alex left the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that Richard wasn't done yet. Something told him the CFO had one last card to play. The boardroom was tense, its atmosphere weighed down by the unspoken anticipation of conflict. Around the long oak table sat TechWave's board members, a mixture of seasoned executives and newer appointees, each projecting varying degrees of curiosity, skepticism, and unease. At the head of the table, Margaret Johnson exuded quiet authority. To her right sat Richard Thompson, radiating a cold confidence that seemed almost performative. His posture was relaxed, his hands resting lightly on the table, as if he had already won whatever battle was about to ensue. Alex sat further down, his palms damp beneath the table. He tried to steady his breathing, but the gravity of the moment was impossible to ignore. Margaret began without preamble. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her tone measured but firm, "I've called this meeting to address a matter of utmost importance, one that directly affects the integrity of TechWave." The board members exchanged glances, the weight of her words setting them on edge. Richard, however, didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed on Margaret, his expression unreadable. Margaret continued, In recent weeks, evidence has come to light suggesting severe financial misconduct by one of our senior executives. She paused, scanning the room. Richard Thompson. The tension in the room spiked. Murmurs rippled around the table, but Margaret pressed on. Through an investigation conducted by a team of our employees, we've uncovered multiple irregularities in company finances. These include unauthorized transfers, fabricated vendor accounts, and encrypted communications concealing questionable transactions. At this, Richard finally reacted. He leaned forward slightly, raising an eyebrow. "I hope you're not suggesting I had anything to do with these so-called irregularities," he said, his voice laced with incredulity. Margaret didn't acknowledge his interjection. Instead, she gestured toward Alex. "Mr. Miller and his colleagues have been instrumental in uncovering these discrepancies. They've provided detailed documentation to support their findings, which I will now share with all of you." She distributed folders to each board member, her calm efficiency contrasting sharply with the tension in the room. Richard sat back, a thin smile playing on his lips as the board members began flipping through the documents. "Take your time," Margaret said, folding her hands in front of her. "These files outline the patterns of financial abuse and the steps taken to conceal them." For several minutes, the room was filled with the sound of rustling papers and the occasional gasp of disbelief. Alex's heart pounded as he watched the board members' expressions shift from confusion to concern. Finally, one of the board members, a man with silver hair and sharp eyes, spoke up. "This is damning evidence, Richard," he said, his voice heavy. "Do you have an explanation for any of this?" Richard laughed softly, shaking his head as though the question were absurd. "This is ridiculous," he said, his tone carefully measured. "Margaret, I'm shocked you would entertain these baseless accusations." "And from whom?" "A junior employee with no understanding of the complexities of corporate finance." He turned to Alex, his gaze sharp and mocking. "Tell me, Mr. Miller, what exactly qualifies you to assess my actions? A few spreadsheets? A hunch?" Alex swallowed hard but stood, determined to hold his ground. "With all due respect, Mr. Thompson," he began, his voice steadier than he expected. "This isn't about my qualifications. It's about the facts. The documents speak for themselves and they show a clear pattern of deception." Richard's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Ah, yes," he said, leaning forward. "And I suppose you uncovered all this on your own? Or were you persuaded by someone with an agenda?" His eyes flicked to Margaret, a pointed insinuation hanging in the air. Margaret's expression didn't waver. "This isn't about agendas, Richard," she said evenly. "It's about accountability." But Richard wasn't finished. "Accountability," he repeated with a bitter laugh, spoken by someone who has her own skeletons. "Tell me, Margaret, how many deals have you signed without reading the fine print? How many decisions have been made under your watch that could come back to haunt you?" The boardroom erupted into murmurs again, and Alex's chest tightened. The atmosphere had shifted. Richard's counterattack had planted seeds of doubt. Margaret raised her hand, commanding silence. "Enough," she said firmly. Her voice cut through the noise like a blade. "This meeting is not about deflection or distractions. It's about the evidence before us and the harm that's been done to this company." One of the board members, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, spoke up. "Margaret's right. Whether or not there were past mistakes, that doesn't absolve Richard of the allegations at hand. We need clarity, and we need it fast." Margaret nodded. "That's why I'm proposing an independent audit. If you're innocent, Richard, you have nothing to fear." Richard's jaw tightened, but his smirk remained. "Of course," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "By all means, bring in your auditors. I have nothing to hide." The meeting concluded with the board agreeing to the audit. As the members began to leave, murmuring among themselves, Margaret approached Alex. "You held your own," she said quietly, a note of pride in her voice. "Barely," Alex admitted. "He's good at turning the conversation back on you." Margaret's expression hardened. "He's a master manipulator, but he's not invincible. The audit will expose the truth. Be ready, Alex. This is far from over." As Alex watched Richard leave the room, his confident stride betraying no sign of defeat, he couldn't shake the feeling that the CFO still had a few cards left to play. The fallout from the boardroom confrontation was swift and palpable. Richard Thompson, though cornered, was far from defeated. His strategy shifted immediately to damage control and retaliation, and Alex quickly found himself in the crosshairs. By the next morning, whispers followed Alex wherever he went in the office. Conversations that once paused out of courtesy when he entered a room now continued in hushed tones, punctuated by furtive glances in his direction. He caught snippets of remarks, fragments that stung more than he cared to admit. He's trying to make a name for himself, probably staged all of it. Margaret's golden boy. It didn't take long for Alex to piece together the source of these rumors. Richard had wasted no time spreading the idea that Alex had fabricated evidence to curry favor with Margaret, leveraging the founder's trust to push his own agenda. At first, Alex tried to ignore it, focusing on his work and pushing through the growing unease. But the isolation became harder to bear. Colleagues he once collaborated with openly now hesitated to engage with him. A few avoided him altogether. One evening, Alex found himself in the TechWave IT room, going over system logs to ensure nothing critical had been tampered with during the day. The quiet hum of the servers offered a brief reprieve from the tension that had consumed the office. "Hey," a familiar voice called softly from behind him. Alex turned to see Sarah standing in the doorway, her expression a mixture of concern and resolve. "You're still here?" she asked, stepping inside. "I needed to finish this," Alex replied, gesturing to the screen in front of him. "Besides, it's easier to work when half the office isn't staring at me like I'm some kind of fraud." Sarah frowned, crossing her arms. "You know that's exactly what Richard wants, right? He's playing mind games, trying to isolate you." Alex leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. "I thought I was ready for this," he admitted, "but I didn't expect it to feel this personal. It's like no matter what I do, it's not enough to convince people I'm on the right side of this." Sarah walked over and rested a hand on his shoulder. "You are on the right side," she said firmly, "and the people who matter know that. Margaret knows. I know. Emily and James know. Don't let the rest of the noise get to you." Alex gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Sarah. I don't know how I'd handle this without you." She squeezed his shoulder before stepping back. "You won't have to find out. We're in this together." Meanwhile, Margaret had been quietly conducting her own investigation, digging deeper into TechWave's financial history. She knew that uncovering the full extent of Richard's wrongdoing was critical, not just to remove him from power, but to ensure he couldn't leverage hidden assets or alliances against the company. Late one night in her office, surrounded by stacks of reports and financial ledgers, Margaret found herself poring over documents dating back nearly a decade. Most of it was standard corporate paperwork, boring but necessary. But then she came across a file that sent a chill through her. It detailed a series of transactions between TechWave and an entity listed as Northbridge Consultants. The name wasn't familiar, but the amounts involved were staggering. Even more concerning were the dates. They coincided with a time when TechWave had been locked in a brutal competition with Orion Systems, a rival company that had nearly driven them out of the market. Margaret's breath hitched as she traced the transactions further. Northbridge wasn't just a third-party consultant. It was a shell company tied directly to Orion Systems, and the payments weren't for services. They were bribes and kickbacks, funneled through intermediaries to sabotage TechWave from within. Her hand trembled as she realized the implications. Richard hadn't just been embezzling funds. He had been colluding with a company that had actively tried to destroy TechWave. Margaret sat back, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her. She knew she had to act immediately, but she also knew how dangerous this information was. Richard had proven he was willing to go to great lengths to protect himself, and exposing his ties to Orion could provoke a backlash she wasn't yet prepared for. The next morning, Margaret called Alex to her office. As he entered, she looked up from her desk, her face a mask of calm professionalism, though her eyes betrayed the storm raging beneath. "Alex," she said, motioning for him to sit. He complied, noting the tension in her posture. "You found something, didn't you?" She nodded slowly. "Richard's misdeeds go far deeper than we imagined. I've uncovered evidence linking him to Orion Systems, specifically payments made during their attempts to sabotage us years ago." Alex's eyes widened. "You're saying Richard was working with Orion? That he was actively trying to take TechWave down?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Margaret replied. "And if this comes to light, it won't just be Richard on the line. It could have serious repercussions for the company. Our reputation, our stakeholders, everything could be at risk." Alex leaned forward, his mind racing. "What do we do? Do we take this to the board? Margaret hesitated. Not yet. We need to gather more concrete evidence before we make any public moves. If we act too soon, Richard will deny everything and use his influence to bury us. But we can't wait long. The audit is coming, and if he catches wind of this, he'll destroy anything that ties him to Orion. Alex nodded, his determination renewed. Whatever you need, I'm ready. Margaret offered a small, appreciative smile. Good, because this fight is far from over. As Alex left her office, he couldn't help but feel the stakes rising. They had uncovered something monumental, but with it came greater danger. He knew Richard wouldn't go down without a fight, and the next round was about to begin. The air in TechWave grew heavier with every passing day. Margaret's discovery about Richard's connection to Orion systems was a ticking time bomb, and Alex could feel the tension building with every glance, every half-formed whisper in the office. Richard hadn't slowed his efforts to discredit Alex, and now the stakes were higher than ever. Margaret summoned Alex, Sarah, Emily, and Michael to her office late one evening. When they arrived, she wasted no time getting to the point. "I've devised a plan," Margaret said, her voice firm as she stood behind her desk, hands gripping the back of her chair. "We need definitive evidence that Richard is actively covering his tracks and working against TechWave, and we need it fast." Alex exchanged a glance with Sarah, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "What kind of plan?" Alex asked, leaning forward in his seat. Margaret straightened, her gaze sharp. "We're going to set a trap. Richard doesn't know we've connected him to Orion, but he's aware of the audit. He'll likely try to destroy or hide anything that ties him to their sabotage. We're going to give him an opportunity, and we'll be watching." Michael leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "You mean plant something and see if he takes the bait?" "Exactly," Margaret replied. "So I've had our legal team draft a mock document, a report that appears to expose Richard's connection to Northbridge Consultants, the shell company tied to Orion. It will suggest we've already linked the payments to him and are preparing to present it to the board." Emily frowned. "And how do we make sure he sees it?" Margaret gave a small, calculated smile. "We'll leave it somewhere he won't be able to resist accessing, on the shared drive, under a restricted folder with minimal but plausible access permissions. It will look like a mistake, something someone forgot to secure properly." Alex felt a chill run through him. "You think he'll try to delete it?" Margaret nodded. "Or edit it or move it. Whatever he does, Michael will be monitoring every step he takes." Michael cracked a grin. "Now you're speaking my language. I can track everything he does, what files he opens, what changes he makes, even what devices he uses. If he takes the bait, we'll know." Sarah crossed her arms. "And if he doesn't?" Margaret's expression hardened. "Then we'll escalate. But given his desperation and arrogance, I don't believe he'll be able to resist. This is our best chance to catch him red-handed." The trap was set the next morning. Michael worked late into the night, creating the perfect digital breadcrumb trail leading to the fake document. By the time the office opened, the file was sitting innocently on the shared drive, waiting for Richard to take the bait. Meanwhile, Alex tried to maintain his composure. He threw himself into his work, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed him everywhere. Sarah stopped by his desk around noon, dropping a cup of coffee in front of him. "You look like you haven't slept," she said, pulling up a chair. Alex gave her a tired smile. "I haven't. Margaret's plan, it's brilliant, but the waiting is killing me. What if Richard doesn't take the bait? Or worse, what if he figures out it's a trap?" Sarah shrugged. "Then we adapt. But honestly, Alex, Richard's ego won't let him walk away from this. He needs control, and he'll do whatever it takes to keep it." Her words offered some comfort, but Alex couldn't shake the tension in his gut. By the end of the day, Michael called a meeting in the small conference room where the team often gathered. He looked energized, his laptop open, and a mischievous glint in his eye. "He took the bait," Michael announced, as soon as everyone was seated. "What?" Alex sat up straighter, adrenaline spiking. "What did he do?" Michael turned his screen toward the group, displaying a series of logs. "About an hour ago, Richard accessed the shared drive from his laptop. He opened the fake report and spent 15 minutes reading it. Then he copied it to a USB drive and deleted the original from the shared folder." Sarah let out a low whistle. "He deleted it. Bold move." "Not just that," Michael continued, scrolling through more logs. "He also tried to access other files on the drive, likely looking for more information, but I locked everything else down beforehand. He's definitely on edge. Emily frowned. If he copied the file, he's probably planning to cover his tracks later. What's our next move? Margaret, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. We escalate, she said. We have enough now to show he's actively tampering with company files, but we're going to push him further. Alex tilted his head. How? Margaret gave him a knowing look. By letting him think he's ahead. I'll have someone from IT notice the file's deletion and report it to the board. That will put Richard on high alert. In his panic, he'll make more mistakes, and we'll be watching every one of them. The next day, Margaret's plan went into motion. An email was sent to the board, notifying them of an accidental deletion of a critical document from the shared drive. Richard, of course, was copied on the email. Alex watched from his desk as Richard read the email, his jaw tightening and his eyes narrowing. The CFO quickly retreated to his office, slamming the door behind him. An hour later, Michael sent a message to the team. He's trying to access restricted accounts. Meet in the conference room. In the conference room, Michael shared his screen once again. He's in full panic mode, Michael said, pointing to a list of recent activity. He's accessing financial records, trying to clean up the evidence we already have. But here's the kicker. He's using his personal laptop instead of his work-issued one. He thinks that will keep him off the radar. Emily smirked. Clearly, he doesn't know who he's dealing with. Michael grinned. Exactly, everything he's doing is being logged. By the time he's done, we'll have an airtight case. Alex felt a surge of hope. For the first time in weeks, it felt like they were finally gaining the upper hand. By the end of the day, Margaret called a private meeting with Alex and the team. We've got him, she said, her tone resolute. The audit logs, the tampering, the connection to Orion, it's all there. I'll present this to the board tomorrow, and this time, Richard won't be able to weasel his way out. Alex felt a weight lift off his shoulders, but he knew the fight wasn't over yet. Margaret's confidence was reassuring, but Richard wasn't the type to go down quietly. As they left the meeting, Alex exchanged a look with Sarah. Tomorrow's going to be big, he said. She nodded. Big and dangerous. Be ready. Alex nodded, steeling himself for what was to come. Richard's temporary suspension from TechWave created an immediate ripple effect. His absence from the office didn't mean his influence had vanished. On the contrary, it lingered like a storm cloud over the company, feeding rumors and uncertainties. Not one to leave quietly, Richard had already begun his counteroffensive, threatening a lawsuit against TechWave. In his statements to the board and the media, he painted himself as a victim of a calculated conspiracy orchestrated by Margaret and Alex. He spun a narrative of betrayal, twisting facts to suit his defense. Alex, meanwhile, found himself more deeply entrenched in TechWave's operations as Margaret relied on him for insights and updates. But something felt off. Margaret, typically composed and decisive, seemed preoccupied. There were moments in meetings where she appeared distracted, and Alex couldn't shake the feeling that she was carrying a weight she hadn't shared with anyone. One morning, after a particularly strained meeting, Alex decided to confront her. He knocked lightly on the door of her office, waiting for her response. "Come in," Margaret called, her voice lacking its usual strength. Alex stepped inside and paused. The normally pristine office was cluttered with stacks of documents, scattered papers, and open folders. Margaret sat behind her desk, her shoulders slightly slumped, a rare vulnerability etched into her face. She looked up, offering him a tired but welcoming smile. "Alex," she said, setting her pen down. "What brings you here?" He hesitated, then moved closer, shutting the door behind him. "I need to ask you something," he began carefully. "Is everything okay? I mean, beyond Richard. You seem different lately, like there's something else going on." Margaret sighed, leaning back in her chair. Her gaze shifted to the window, where she stared out for a long moment before answering. "You're perceptive," she admitted. "There is something I've been avoiding for a long time." Alex pulled a chair closer, his concern deepening. "Margaret, if it's affecting you or the company, you need to tell me. I want to help." She turned back to him, her expression weary but resolute. "All right," she said softly. "It's time you knew the truth." Alex leaned in, his full attention on her. "Years ago, when I started TechWave," she began, "I was young and ambitious, but I was also naive. The tech world is ruthless, Alex. It's not just about innovation, it's about survival. And survival means navigating a minefield of competitors, investors, and predators, all willing to do whatever it takes to win. Her voice carried an emotion Alex hadn't heard from her before, a mixture of regret and pain. One of those predators was Richard, she continued, but he wasn't always the CFO. He started as an external consultant, brought in during one of TechWave's most difficult periods. We were struggling to secure funding for a major project, and I was desperate. Richard came highly recommended as someone who could fix financial bottlenecks. Alex's brow furrowed. What happened? Margaret's jaw tightened. At first, he seemed like a godsend. He streamlined processes, attracted investors, and presented solutions that appeared to save the company. I trusted him completely. But then, things started to unravel. She gestured to one of the documents on her desk. He manipulated the financial reports, falsified projections to make our numbers look better than they were. By the time I realized what he was doing, the damage was done. TechWave was on the brink of collapse, and Richard had lined his pockets in the process. Alex stared at her, stunned. And you brought him into the company after that? Margaret's expression darkened. I didn't have a choice. Richard had leverage, knowledge of TechWave's vulnerabilities, connections with key investors, and enough evidence of our struggles to make us look like a failing enterprise. He made it clear that if I didn't bring him on board, he would destroy everything I'd built. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. So I did it. I brought him in, thinking I could control him. I thought I could keep him in check, but I was wrong. He spent years testing me, pushing boundaries, always looking for ways to consolidate his power. Alex shook his head, trying to process what he was hearing. Why didn't you tell the board? Or anyone else? Margaret let out a bitter laugh. Because back then, the board was made up of people Richard had already won over. They saw him as a necessary evil, someone who could navigate the dirty waters of corporate finance so they wouldn't have to. And as for anyone else, who would believe me? I was the one who let him in. Alex's voice was quiet, but firm. And now? Now, Margaret said, her eyes meeting his. He's more dangerous than ever. Because what you and your team uncovered doesn't just implicate him, it implicates the people he's been working with. And Alex, Richard doesn't work alone. He's part of something much bigger. Alex leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. You're saying there's more? That Richard is connected to, what, some kind of network? Margaret nodded slowly. A network of individuals and entities that operate in the shadows. Shell companies, false contracts, insider trading. They use corporations like TechWave as pawns in a much larger game, and Richard is their man on the inside. Alex's stomach churned. And the board? Some of them might be involved, Margaret admitted. Others are just blind to what's happening. But if we're going to stop Richard, we have to be prepared for the possibility that we're up against more than just him. The weight of her words settled heavily on Alex. The battle they were fighting wasn't just about Richard's corruption. It was about dismantling an entire web of deceit that threatened the very foundation of TechWave. Margaret's voice softened. I know this is a lot to take in, Alex, but I need you to stay focused. You've been instrumental in exposing Richard, and I believe you can help us finish this. But we have to be smart. No more mistakes. Alex nodded, his resolve hardening. I'm with you, Margaret, whatever it takes. She gave him a faint smile, the first sign of relief he'd seen from her all day. Thank you, Alex. Now let's get to work. As Alex left her office, the gravity of their fight became clearer than ever. This wasn't just about protecting a company. It was about exposing a system of corruption that went far beyond TechWave's walls. And he knew the battle ahead would test them all in ways they hadn't yet imagined. Margaret's revelations weighed heavily on Alex as he processed the enormity of what they were up against. TechWave, a company he had admired and believed in, was at the center of something far darker than he had imagined. A network of corruption involving other companies and shadowy external figures. Sitting across from Margaret in her office, Alex tried to steady his thoughts. You're certain Richard's at the center of all this? He asked, his voice measured but tense. Margaret nodded, her expression grim. I am. But there's still so much we don't know. Richard isn't working alone, that much is clear. What I've uncovered suggests a deliberate effort to use TechWave as a facade, a front for laundering money, evading taxes, and possibly worse. Alex felt the weight of her words settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about one corrupt executive. It was about dismantling an entire operation. "What do we do next?" he asked, his determination overriding the doubt creeping in. Margaret leaned forward. "We track every move he's made, every contract he's signed, every person he's been in contact with over the last few months. We need to identify his network and figure out who else is involved. But we have to be extremely careful. If Richard gets wind of what we're doing, he'll do everything in his power to stop us." Before Alex could respond, the door to Margaret's office opened slightly, and Emily Davis stepped in, her expression resolute. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Emily said, glancing between the two of them. "But I couldn't help overhearing. I want in." Margaret hesitated, her brow furrowing. "Emily, this is dangerous. If Richard realizes—" "I don't care," Emily interrupted, her voice steady. "TechWave means everything to me, and I'm not going to stand by while he destroys it. Whatever you need, I'll do it." Margaret studied her for a moment before giving a small nod. "All right, we'll need every ally we can trust." The group reconvened later that evening in their usual makeshift war room, a small conference room tucked away from prying eyes. Margaret outlined the plan, dividing the tasks among them. "Alex, Michael," she said, turning to the two of them, "you'll focus on retrieving old documents, anything Richard might have tried to delete or hide. We need a complete picture of his financial activity." Michael nodded, already pulling up a laptop. "I can start pulling logs and backups from the server. If there's anything he's erased, I'll find it." Margaret then looked at Emily and Sarah. "You'll work on external connections. Analyze the vendors, consultants, and contractors linked to TechWave. Cross-reference them with the information we have on Northbridge consultants and any other suspicious entities." Sarah gave a curt nod. "On it." Emily added, "We'll look for patterns, repeat names, unusual payments, anything that doesn't add up." Alex spoke up, his voice cautious. "Margaret, what about Richard? He's not exactly the type to sit back and wait for us to make a move. If he starts to suspect—" "He already suspects," Margaret interrupted, her tone sharper than intended. She sighed, softening slightly. "Richard knows something is happening. That's why we need to stay ahead of him. Whatever he's planning, we have to be ready." Over the next few days, the team worked tirelessly, meeting in secret to exchange updates. Michael was the first to make a breakthrough. Late one night, he called Alex to his desk, his eyes alight with excitement. "You're going to want to see this," Michael said, gesturing to his screen. "What did you find?" Alex asked, leaning over. Michael pointed to a series of recovery logs. "These are files Richard tried to delete months ago. I pulled them from an old backup he didn't realize was still active. Look at this." On the screen was a spreadsheet detailing payments to various shell companies. The amounts were staggering, and the descriptions vague at best. "These payments don't make sense," Alex said, frowning. "Exactly," Michael replied. "Most of them are routed through intermediaries, but some of the names match vendors Emily flagged as suspicious." Alex's eyes widened. "That's the connection we needed. This ties the internal corruption to the external network." Meanwhile, Emily and Sarah had their own discovery. Over coffee in the break room one afternoon, they compared notes. "Look at this," Emily said, sliding her laptop over to Sarah. "These contractors, half of them don't even exist. Fake addresses, no online presence, nothing." Sarah shook her head. "And these ones? They've been paid for services that don't match anything we've ever needed. Logistics, high-level consulting, even catering for events that never happened." Emily frowned. "This isn't just about stealing money. They're using us to funnel it elsewhere." As the pieces came together, the team met again in the conference room to pool their findings. "This is bigger than we thought," Sarah said, laying out the documents they'd compiled. "Richard isn't just pocketing money, he's running a full-blown operation. Shell companies, fake vendors, falsified services, it's all here. And he's not alone," Emily added. "The names we've uncovered link back to other companies, some of them with their own histories of shady practices. This is a network, and TechWave is just one piece of it." Margaret looked over the documents, her face a mask of focus. "This is enough to make a case," she said, "but we need to move carefully. If Richard gets wind of how much we know, he'll go to ground, and we'll lose our chance to expose the whole network." Alex leaned forward, his voice firm. "Then we move fast. We've already seen what Richard is capable of. If we wait, we're giving him time to cover his tracks." Margaret nodded, her decision made. "Agreed. Let's finalize everything we have. Tomorrow we bring this to the board." As the meeting ended and the team dispersed, Alex lingered behind with Margaret. "Do you think we'll be able to stop him?" he asked quietly. Margaret met his gaze, her voice steady but tinged with steel. "We don't have a choice, Alex. If we don't stop him, this entire company could crumble. But make no mistake, this will be a fight." And Alex knew she was right. The battle against Richard wasn't just about saving TechWave anymore. It was about exposing a network of corruption that threatened to destroy everything they had worked for, and the fight was only just beginning. The days after the team's discoveries were intense. Margaret worked tirelessly to organize the evidence for a formal presentation to the board, while Alex, Sarah, Emily, and Michael continued digging for any additional threads that could strengthen their case. Everyone knew time was running out, and Richard was becoming increasingly desperate. Alex was wrapping up his day at his desk when his phone buzzed. The screen displayed an unknown number. For a moment, he hesitated. Normally, he'd let it go to voicemail, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello?" he said cautiously. There was a pause, and then a cold, familiar voice came through the line. "You should have stayed in your lane, Miller." Alex's breath caught in his throat. "Richard," he said, his voice low. "Ah, so you recognize me," Richard replied, his tone mocking. "Good. I'd hate for you to forget who you're dealing with." Alex's hand tightened around the phone, his mind racing. "What do you want?" Richard chuckled, the sound hollow and unnerving. "What I want, Alex, is for you and your little band of heroes to stop meddling in things you don't understand. You think you've got me cornered? You're nothing but children playing detective." "We're not playing," Alex said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "We have the evidence. It's over for you." For a moment, there was silence on the other end, and then Richard's tone turned deadly. "Careful, boy. You don't know the kind of people you're messing with. You think I'm the villain in your little story? You have no idea how deep this goes." "Then why are you the one calling me, Richard?" Alex shot back, his anger pushing through his fear. Richard laughed again, but there was no amusement in it. "Because I like to give fair warnings. This is yours. Back off or you'll regret it." Before Alex could respond, the line went dead. Alex sat frozen for a moment, his heart pounding. The conversation replayed in his mind, each word dripping with menace. He quickly gathered his things and made his way to Margaret's office, ignoring the late hour. Margaret looked up as Alex entered, noting the tension in his expression. "Alex, what's wrong?" He shut the door behind him and set his phone on her desk. "Richard called me," he said flatly. Margaret's brows furrowed. "What did he say?" Alex recounted the conversation, his voice steady despite the unease simmering beneath the surface. When he finished, Margaret leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled. "This proves he's feeling the pressure," she said after a moment, "but it also proves he's willing to do anything to protect himself." Alex nodded. "He doesn't sound like someone who's ready to go quietly. He kept hinting at something bigger, like he's not the only one we're up against." Margaret's eyes darkened. "That's what worries me the most. Richard isn't bluffing. If he says there are others, then there are, and they'll protect their interests at all costs." "What do we do?" Alex asked. Margaret sat forward, her gaze intense. "First, we protect ourselves. I'll arrange for additional security, both for the office and for all of you personally. From now on, no one works late alone, and no one goes anywhere without letting the rest of the team know. Is that clear?" Alex nodded. "Understood." The next day, Margaret convened a meeting with the team. They gathered in the small conference room, the mood tense but focused. "Richard's escalated," Margaret began, addressing them. "Last night he called Alex directly, issuing veiled threats." Sarah's jaw tightened. "He's trying to scare us off. Classic bully tactic." "It's more than that," Margaret said. "He's testing us, trying to gauge how close we are to exposing him. That means we're on the right track, but it also means we're in danger." Emily frowned. "So what do we do? Just keep digging and hope he doesn't make good on his threats?" "No," Margaret replied firmly. "We take precautions. I've arranged for additional security in the office, and I'm issuing new access protocols for sensitive files. Beyond that, we stay vigilant. No one works alone, and everyone reports anything unusual immediately." Michael raised a hand slightly. "What about the evidence we've already collected? Should we secure it somewhere off-site in case he tries to pull something drastic?" "Good thinking," Margaret said. "I'll handle that personally." Alex spoke up. "And what about Richard? He's not going to stop at phone calls. He knows we're closing in. If he's desperate enough to make threats, he might try something more direct." Margaret nodded, her expression grim. "That's why we need to finish this quickly. The sooner we present our case to the board, the less time Richard has to counter us. We're not just fighting him, we're fighting the clock." Over the next few days, the team operated under heightened alert. Alex found himself looking over his shoulder more often than he cared to admit, and every unfamiliar face in the office felt like a potential threat. One evening, as he was leaving for the day, Sarah caught up to him in the parking lot. "Hey," she said, falling into step beside him. "You okay?" "Define okay," Alex replied with a wry smile. Sarah smirked but didn't press further. "Look, I know this is getting intense, but we've got your back. Whatever Richard throws at us, we'll handle it together." Alex nodded, grateful for her support. "Thanks, Sarah, that means a lot." Meanwhile, Margaret worked late into the night, consolidating the evidence and preparing for the upcoming board presentation. She knew the stakes couldn't be higher, not just for TechWave, but for everyone involved. As she reviewed the files one last time, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You're playing a dangerous game, Margaret. Careful you don't lose." Margaret stared at the message for a moment before deleting it. She wouldn't let fear dictate her actions. The battle was far from over, but she was determined to win. The office was quiet as Alex and Michael sat in the IT department, surrounded by monitors glowing with rows of data. The search for more concrete evidence against Richard had been slow and tedious, but both men were driven by a shared determination to find the smoking gun that would bring him down. It was nearly midnight when Michael's voice broke the silence. "Wait a second," he said, leaning closer to his screen. "I think I've got something." Alex, who had been scrolling through old emails on another monitor, turned toward him. "What is it?" Michael clicked through a series of files, bringing up an old contract buried deep in the company's archives. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a specific section of the document. Alex moved to stand behind Michael's chair, his eyes scanning the text. At first glance, the contract appeared mundane, a standard agreement between TechWave and a vendor. But then he spotted the clause Michael was referring to. "A percentage of the profits shall be allocated to Silver Edge Investments." Alex read aloud, his brow furrowing. "I've never heard of that company." "Neither have I," Michael replied, already typing furiously. "Let's see what we can dig up." Within minutes, Michael pulled up information that made Alex's stomach twist. Silver Edge Investments was connected to a web of smaller companies, all of which had mysteriously gone bankrupt shortly after engaging with TechWave. "Look at this," Michael said, gesturing to a list of company names. Every single one of these entities funneled money into Silver Edge before they collapsed. It's like they were being drained dry. Alex's jaw tightened. "And you're saying this connects to Richard?" Michael nodded, bringing up another screen. "The payment records match. Richard's name is all over this. But here's the kicker. Margaret's signature is on one of these contracts too." Alex froze, his mind racing. "Margaret signed off on this." Michael turned to face him, his expression serious. "It's possible she didn't know what she was signing. This clause is buried deep in the contract, and the wording is vague enough to fly under the radar. But still, it's her name on the dotted line." Alex ran a hand through his hair, tension building in his chest. "We have to tell her. If she didn't know, she needs to understand what Richard's been using her name to do." Michael hesitated. "And if she did know?" Alex didn't answer immediately. The thought made him uneasy, but he refused to let doubt creep in. "Then we'll deal with it. But I don't think Margaret's complicit. Richard's been manipulating people for years. This could be another example." The next morning, Alex brought the documents to Margaret's office. He entered cautiously, sensing the gravity of the conversation they were about to have. "Margaret," he began, setting the papers on her desk, "Michael and I found something. You need to see this." Margaret looked up from her laptop, her expression already concerned. She pulled the documents toward her and began to read. As her eyes moved over the text, her face remained calm, but Alex could see the flicker of recognition in her gaze. When she reached the clause about Silver Edge Investments, she set the papers down and leaned back in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a long moment she said nothing. "Margaret?" Alex prompted gently. She exhaled slowly, her voice quiet but steady. "I remember this contract. It was years ago during one of TechWave's most turbulent periods. We were desperate for stability, And Richard brought this agreement to me as a solution. Alex sat across from her, his brow furrowed. Did you know about Silver Edge? About what it was being used for? Margaret shook her head, a shadow of regret crossing her features. Richard told me it was a consultancy arrangement, a way to streamline operations and cut costs. I trusted him, Alex. Back then, I didn't question him as much as I should have. Alex leaned forward, his voice firm but not accusatory. Margaret, this clause, the payments, the bankrupt companies, Richard used your name to legitimize this. It's not just a bad contract, it's part of a larger scheme to funnel money into his network. Margaret's jaw tightened, and Alex could see the determination building in her eyes. He manipulated me, she said, her tone edged with anger. He used my trust and my authority to cover his tracks, and now he's going to pay for it. Alex nodded, feeling the weight of her words. What's our next step? Margaret stood, pacing to the window as she spoke. We finalize our evidence. With this contract, we have a direct link between Richard, Silver Edge, and the larger network he's been operating. We take this to the board and present it alongside everything else we've uncovered. She turned back to Alex, her expression resolute. But we need to move quickly. If Richard realizes we've found this, he'll do everything in his power to destroy it. And us. Alex stood as well, his resolve matching hers. Then let's finish this. As he left her office, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that they were nearing a breaking point. The pieces of Richard's operation were falling into place, but the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous the situation became. The battle against Richard was about to reach its climax, and Alex knew the coming days would test them all like never before. Margaret's office was a hive of controlled urgency. The team, now armed with their most damning evidence yet, worked tirelessly to prepare for what was shaping up to be the final confrontation. Margaret had developed a bold plan. She would summon Richard to a private meeting under the guise of discussing his suspension. But this time investigators from an external firm would be present, recording and analyzing every word, every document, every move he made. The stakes were impossibly high. Late into the night, Alex, Sarah, Emily, and Michael sat in their makeshift war room. Stacks of documents, spreadsheets, and laptop screens surrounded them, the evidence of Richard's sprawling corruption network coming into sharper focus with every passing hour. I'm starting to think Silver Edge is just the tip of the iceberg, Emily said, scrolling through a web of connected entities on her laptop. Look at this. Payments flowing between shell companies in different countries. Some of these transactions don't even have a clear origin. Money laundering, Michael muttered, his fingers tapping furiously on his keyboard. Richard's not just stealing. He's funneling money through an international web of fake businesses. This isn't just corporate fraud. That's criminal enterprise. Alex leaned over Michael's screen, his jaw tightening. And TechWave is right in the middle of it. Every one of these fake vendors ties back to Richard. This isn't about greed anymore. It's about power. Power and leverage, Sarah added, studying a list of Richard's known associates. These people aren't just helping him, they're protecting him. If we don't nail him tomorrow, he'll use every connection he has to bury us. The room fell silent for a moment, as the enormity of their task settled over them. The next day, as the team finalized their preparations, Margaret took Alex aside. Alex, she began, her voice measured but tinged with gravity. Tomorrow is going to test us all. Richard isn't just going to sit back and let us take him down. He'll fight with everything he has. Alex nodded. I understand, but we're ready for this. Margaret studied him for a moment, then placed a hand on his shoulder. You've been at the center of this since the beginning. Your work has been invaluable, but tomorrow we'll need your voice too. You've seen more of Richard's manipulation firsthand than anyone else. That perspective will matter. I'll be ready, Alex promised, though the weight of her words settled heavily on him. That evening, Alex found himself on the rooftop terrace of the TechWave building, needing a moment to clear his head. The city lights stretched out before him, but his thoughts were consumed by the looming confrontation. Mind some company? Sarah's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Alex glanced back and saw her stepping onto the terrace, 2 cups of coffee in hand. She offered him one and he accepted it with a small smile. You're still here? He asked. I could ask you the same thing, she replied, taking a sip of her coffee before leaning against the railing beside him. Big day tomorrow. Yes, Alex said, staring at the skyline. I keep asking myself if we're really ready. What if we missed something? What if Richard pulls a move we didn't see coming? Sarah nudged him lightly with her elbow. Alex, look at everything we've done. The evidence we've gathered, the risks we've taken. We've built an airtight case. Richard's days of manipulation are over. Alex let out a breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. I just don't want to let anyone down. Margaret, the team, you. Sarah smiled softly and leaned her head against his shoulder. You're stronger than you think, Alex. You've already proven that. For the first time in days, Alex felt a flicker of hope. The battle ahead was daunting, but he wasn't facing it alone. The people by his side were more than colleagues. They were allies, friends, and a reminder of why this fight mattered. Margaret, meanwhile, was in her office making the final arrangements. The investigators she'd hired were already briefed, ready to monitor the upcoming meeting. Every detail had been accounted for, from the positioning of recording devices to the backup copies of the evidence stored securely off-site. As she double-checked the agenda for the next day, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. You don't know what you're starting. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. She deleted the message and returned to her work, determined not to let fear derail her focus. The next morning, the team gathered early. Margaret addressed them one final time before the meeting with Richard. This is it, she said, her tone firm. Today, we take the fight to him. But be prepared. Richard isn't going down without a fight. He'll have a plan, and we need to be ready for anything. As they left the room, Alex couldn't shake the sense that Margaret was right. Richard wasn't just going to sit back and accept defeat. He had something planned, something that could turn everything upside down. And by the end of the day, Alex and the team would come face to face with a devastating twist they never saw coming. The morning was tense at TechWave, and Margaret's energy reflected the weight of what was at stake. She gathered Alex, Sarah, Emily, and Michael in a small conference room for a final briefing before the confrontation with Richard. Today will be decisive, Margaret said, her voice steady but edged with determination. We have everything we need to expose him, but remember, Richard is a master manipulator. Stay sharp and don't let him distract you. Alex nodded, exchanging a glance with Sarah, who gave him a reassuring smile. Emily and Michael sat across from them, their expressions focused and ready. We're with you, Alex said, his voice firm. Margaret's eyes swept over the group, a faint hint of pride breaking through her serious demeanor. Good, let's finish this. The conference room was meticulously prepared. Discrete recording devices were positioned around the space, capturing both audio and video. In a separate room, 2 external investigators waited, ready to intervene if the situation escalated. Richard arrived promptly, as expected. He strode into the room with his usual air of arrogance, a confident smirk playing on his lips. His tailored suit and deliberate movements screamed control, as if he were stepping onto a stage where he believed he was the lead actor. Margaret, Richard said smoothly as he took a seat, always an honor to be summoned for such important discussions. Margaret, seated at the head of the table, met his gaze with unwavering resolve. We have serious matters to address, Richard, she replied. And this time you won't leave without providing answers. Richard raised an eyebrow, his smirk deepening. Serious matters? I can't wait to hear what new fiction you've crafted. Margaret didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she motioned for Alex, who handed her a thick folder of documents. She slid them across the table toward Richard, her movements deliberate. These, she said, her voice cutting, are records linking you to Silver Edge Investments. They detail fraudulent contracts, unauthorized transfers, and a systematic effort to funnel money out of TechWave. Richard picked up the folder with a deliberate air of disinterest, flipping through the pages as if they were yesterday's newspaper. His calm demeanor didn't falter, even as his eyes moved over the damning evidence. Interesting, he remarked after a moment, his tone almost amused. You've certainly done your homework. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. This isn't homework, Richard. It's proof that you've been using this company to launder money and line your pockets at everyone else's expense. Richard leaned back in his chair, letting out a low chuckle. Oh, Margaret, you've always been brilliant, but today you've outdone yourself. Unfortunately, you're also making a terrible mistake. Before anyone could respond, Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a USB drive. He held it up with a theatrical flourish, his smirk returning. "If we're presenting evidence," he said, standing and walking toward the projector at the front of the room, "I think it's only fair that I contribute to the discussion." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing, Richard?" "You'll see," he replied, plugging the USB into the projector. The screen on the wall lit up, displaying a video file. As it began to play, the room fell into a stunned silence. The video showed Margaret years earlier signing contracts with vendors, shaking hands with individuals who were later revealed to be tied to Silver Edge Investments. The footage was edited to suggest that Margaret was not only aware of the fraudulent activities but actively involved in orchestrating them. Alex's breath caught. "What is this?" "Carefully curated fiction," Margaret said coldly, though her grip on the table tightened. Richard turned to face the room, his smirk now a full-blown grin. "I believe the phrase you used was proof, Margaret. Here it is. Evidence of your own involvement in the very activities you're accusing me of." Sarah stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. That footage is manipulated." Richard shrugged. "Is it? Or is this just a convenient narrative you're spinning now that the tables have turned?" Margaret remained calm, though Alex could see the tension in her posture. "This changes nothing," she said. "The evidence we've gathered proves your guilt, Richard. No amount of fabricated footage will absolve you." Richard's grin didn't waver. "You underestimate how convincing this will be to the board and the authorities. Who do you think they'll believe, a trusted CFO with years of service or a founder desperate to save face?" Alex couldn't stay silent. "You're desperate, Richard. That's why you're resorting to this. You know your time is up." Richard's gaze turned icy. "Careful, Miller. You're out of your depth here." Margaret glanced at Alex, signaling for calm before addressing Richard again. "We expected you to have a plan, Richard," she said, "but you're forgetting one thing." Richard tilted his head, mock curiosity on his face. "Oh, and what's that?" Margaret leaned forward, her voice steady and deliberate. "The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how well you think you've hidden it." As if on cue, the door to the room opened, and the external investigators entered. One of them, a sharp-eyed woman in a tailored suit, addressed Richard directly. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice firm, "we're here to investigate allegations of financial misconduct and fraud. We've been monitoring this meeting, and your actions will be included in our report." For the first time, Richard's confidence faltered. His eyes darted between Margaret, the investigators, and the screen still displaying the incriminating footage. Margaret stood, her gaze locked on Richard. "This isn't just about you anymore, Richard. It's about the network you've built, the people you've manipulated, and the lives you've ruined. You will answer for everything." The room was silent as Richard's smirk finally disappeared, but as he sat down, a new expression crept across his face, one of quiet calculation. Richard wasn't done yet, and Alex knew the battle was far from over. The room was a powder keg, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The video Richard had shown continued to cast shadows on the wall, frozen on a frame that appeared to implicate Margaret in the fraudulent activities tied to Silver Edge Investments. Richard stood at the head of the table, his smile dripping with smug triumph as he addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, gesturing to the screen behind him, "as you can see, our esteemed founder isn't quite the paragon of virtue she claims to be. It seems she's been complicit in the very crimes she accuses me of." The board members exchanged glances, their faces a mix of doubt, confusion, and unease. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Alex's gaze darted to Margaret. She sat rigid, her hands clasped on the table in front of her. Though her face was pale, her eyes burned with unwavering determination. "This is a manipulation," Margaret said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "The video has been doctored." Richard's smirk widened as he leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "Perhaps," he said, his tone smooth, "but the question isn't whether it's real. The question is who the investors and the media will believe. Me? A trusted CFO with a spotless record? Or you, Margaret, someone who's already admitted to signing contracts without due diligence?" Margaret's chest rose and fell as she took a deep breath. When she spoke again, her voice was steady and resolute. "They'll believe the truth, Richard, and I have more than my word to back it up." She raised her hand, signaling to the investigators waiting outside the room. A moment later, they entered, each carrying stacks of folders and hard drives. The woman leading them, the same sharp-eyed investigator who had entered earlier, stepped forward and addressed the room. "These," she began, setting the materials on the table, are independently verified documents detailing Mr. Thompson's activities over the past decade. They include financial records, internal communications, and forensic evidence proving the video you just saw was fabricated. The board members leaned forward, their expressions shifting as the weight of the new evidence became clear. Margaret continued, her tone firm. This is the real story. Richard Thompson has spent years manipulating contracts, diverting funds, and using my name and TechWave's reputation to cover his tracks. Every signature, every decision he's pinned on me was part of his scheme to avoid detection. Richard's laugh was sharp, cutting through the mounting tension, but this time it was forced. "Are you grasping at straws, Margaret?" he said, though his grip on the edge of the table tightened. "You really think a pile of papers will hold up against the narrative I've built? I have allies, powerful ones, who will ensure this never sees the light of day." For a moment the room held its breath. Then Alex, who had remained silent until now, stood. "You might have allies, Richard," Alex said, his voice calm but firm. "But how loyal do you think they'll stay when they see this?" He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a detailed list of transactions, each connecting Richard directly to illicit payments made to external parties. The amounts were staggering, and the recipients included high-profile individuals and entities with reputations to protect. "This," Alex continued, "is a comprehensive record of every illegal transaction you've made. We trace the payments from TechWave to your shell companies and then to the people who've been protecting you. If this goes public, you won't be the only one under scrutiny. Your allies will be too, and something tells me they won't want to go down with you." Richard's smirk faltered. He picked up the folder, flipping through the pages with increasing agitation. For the first time, his confidence cracked, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Sarah leaned forward, her tone razor-sharp. "You've built an empire of lies, Richard, and now it's collapsing. Every person in this room sees it, and soon so will the world." Emily chimed in, her voice steady. "You've underestimated us from the start, but now we have everything we need to end this, and you know it." The board members began murmuring among themselves, the tide of doubt now fully turned against Richard. Margaret stood, her eyes locked on him. "This is over, Richard. You can try to spin your lies, but the truth is coming for you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Richard clenched his jaw, the folder still in his hands. Slowly he straightened, his expression hardening. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice laced with venom. "You think you've won, but you don't know what you've unleashed." Without another word, he gathered his things and walked out of the room. As the door closed behind him, the room fell silent once more. Margaret turned to the board, her voice calm but commanding. "We have one final responsibility," she said, "to ensure that Richard Thompson is held accountable for his actions and that TechWave moves forward with integrity. I trust you'll make the right decision." One by one, the board members nodded, the weight of their agreement clear. Alex exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest finally beginning to ease. But as he met Margaret's gaze, he saw the flicker of unease still lingering there. "He's not done," Alex said quietly, stepping closer to her. Margaret nodded, her expression somber. "No, he's not. And whatever his next move is, we need to be ready." They both knew that while Richard's grip on TechWave was loosening, the battle was far from over, and the storm that followed could change everything. The boardroom was abuzz with tense energy as the decision came down. Richard Thompson would face a full-scale investigation, and his immediate suspension from TechWave was non-negotiable. The weight of the evidence Margaret and the team had presented was undeniable. Even Richard's most loyal allies on the board couldn't justify standing by him any longer. 2 external investigators escorted Richard out of the conference room. He maintained his composure, but his jaw was tight, his eyes blazing with suppressed fury. As they reached the door, he stopped abruptly and turned to face Margaret. "This isn't over," Richard said, his voice low and menacing. "You may have won today, but you have no idea what's coming. You haven't seen the lengths I'm willing to go to." Margaret met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "Don't underestimate the power of the truth, Richard," she replied evenly. "It has a way of catching up with people like you." Richard let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "We'll see." With that, he turned and disappeared down the hallway, the investigators following close behind. As the door closed behind him, the tension in the room finally began to ease. Margaret turned to the board members, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "Thank you all for your cooperation today," she said. "This decision wasn't an easy one, but it was necessary to protect TechWave and its values." The board members nodded, murmuring their agreements. One by one they began to leave, each still processing the magnitude of what had just unfolded. When the room was nearly empty, Margaret turned to Alex, who had been standing quietly near the back, observing everything. Her expression softened as she approached him. "Alex," she began, her voice carrying a rare note of gratitude, "you were brilliant today. The way you presented the evidence, your composure in the face of Richard's tactics, it made all the difference. I don't know how to thank you." Alex shook his head, his voice humble but firm. "This was never just about my career," he said. "It's about doing what's right. TechWave deserves better than Richard. The people here deserve better." Margaret smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through her usual professional exterior. "And because of you, they'll have that. You've done more for this company than I think you realize." Later that evening, the team gathered in their usual conference room, the atmosphere lighter than it had been in weeks. Sarah, Emily, and Michael were seated around the table, their faces showing a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "Well," Sarah said, breaking the silence, "we did it. Richard's out. Feels almost anticlimactic after everything we've been through." "Don't get too comfortable," Michael interjected, his tone cautious. "He's not going to just fade into the background. People like Richard always have a backup plan." Emily nodded in agreement. "Michael's right. We've dealt a serious blow, but he's not done. We need to stay vigilant." Alex, who had been leaning against the wall, crossed his arms. Margaret said the same thing. "Whatever Richard has planned, we need to be ready." Sarah looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "And what about you, Alex? You've been at the center of this from the start. What now?" Alex hesitated, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on him. "We keep going. This isn't just about stopping Richard. It's about rebuilding TechWave, making sure nothing like this ever happens again." The team exchanged determined looks, a renewed sense of purpose settling over them. Meanwhile, in a darkened office somewhere far from TechWave, Richard sat at a desk, his fingers steepled as he stared at a laptop screen. The room was sparse, save for a few files and a phone lying nearby. A knock at the door broke the silence, and a man in a tailored suit stepped inside. "Mr. Thompson," the man said, his tone formal, "the assets have been secured, and your contacts are ready to proceed." Richard's lips curled into a cold smile. "Good," he said, leaning back in his chair. "They think they've won. Let them celebrate. By the time they realize what's coming, it'll be too late." He tapped a finger against the desk, his mind already working several moves ahead. "Let's remind Margaret and her little protege who they're dealing with." At TechWave, Margaret sat alone in her office reviewing the day's events. She couldn't shake the feeling that Richard's parting words weren't just empty threats. She reached for her phone and dialed Alex's number. "Margaret?" Alex answered, his voice curious but alert. "Alex," she said, "I need you to double-check our security protocols. Richard won't go down quietly, and we can't afford any vulnerabilities." "Consider it done," Alex replied. "We'll be ready." As she hung up, Margaret stared out the window, her resolve hardening. She had fought too hard and sacrificed too much to let Richard or anyone else tear down what she had built. The battle wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The days following Richard's removal were a whirlwind of change for TechWave. Margaret wasted no time initiating a full-scale audit of the company, leaving no stone unturned. It wasn't just about ensuring transparency, it was about sending a clear message. TechWave would no longer tolerate corruption or deception. She addressed the entire company in a rare all-hands meeting, her tone resolute. "This is a new chapter for TechWave," she said. "We've faced challenges that tested the very foundation of what we stand for, but we've come through stronger. Together, we'll rebuild trust with our employees, our clients, and our investors. And we will ensure that this company lives up to the values it was built on." The applause was cautious at first, but grew into a groundswell of support. Alex's role in the company shifted dramatically. Margaret offered him a leadership position in the development of new projects, a responsibility he accepted with a mix of pride and apprehension. "You've earned this, Alex," Margaret told him during a private meeting in her office. "Your integrity, your determination, it's exactly what this company needs right now." "I won't let you down," Alex promised, though he couldn't ignore the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. In the weeks that followed, Alex threw himself into his new role, collaborating with his team to lay the groundwork for several innovative projects. The work was intense but rewarding, and it gave him a sense of purpose that helped him push past the lingering stress of the confrontation with Richard. His relationship with Sarah deepened as well. Late nights at the office often turned into quiet moments where they would reflect on everything they'd been through. One evening, after wrapping up a particularly long day, they found themselves alone in the break room. "You've been quiet," Sarah said, watching as Alex stared into his coffee mug. Alex looked up, offering a small smile. "Just thinking. It feels like we've come so far, but there's still this shadow hanging over everything." Sarah moved closer, leaning against the counter beside him. "Richard?" Alex nodded. "Even with him gone, I can't shake the feeling that he's not done. It's like he's still out there waiting for the right moment to strike." Sarah reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "You're not in this alone, Alex. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Her words settled over him like a balm, a reminder that even in the chaos he had allies, friends who had become like family. But the shadow of Richard Thompson refused to fade. Though he had disappeared after his suspension, whispers of his movements began to surface. Some claimed he was building alliances with TechWave's competitors. Others suggested he was planning a legal assault to regain his position. The unease grew palpable when, one evening, Alex's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. He opened it, his brow furrowing as he read the single sentence, "You don't know who you're dealing with." Alex stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. The message was vague, but the threat was unmistakable. He immediately forwarded the message to Margaret with a note. "Received this just now. Thoughts?" Her response came minutes later. "Stay alert. We'll discuss first thing tomorrow." The next day, Alex met with Margaret, Sarah, and Michael in a secure conference room. Margaret read the message aloud, her expression grim. "This confirms what we suspected," she said. "Richard isn't done. He's planning something, and he wants us to know it." Michael tapped on his laptop, scanning through logs. "The number's untraceable, most likely a burner phone, typical tactic for someone trying to stay off the radar." Sarah crossed her arms. "So what's his play? If he's trying to intimidate us, it means he's still on the defensive. But for how long?" Margaret leaned forward, her tone decisive. "We need to stay proactive, Alex. Michael, I want you to tighten security protocols across the board. No gaps, no vulnerabilities. Emily and Sarah, keep monitoring any external activity that could be linked to Richard. And everyone stay vigilant. If Richard's trying to rattle us, we can't afford to let our guard down." Alex nodded, his resolve hardening. If he's expecting us to back off, he's in for a surprise. That evening, as Alex returned to his apartment, the weight of the day lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that Richard's next move would be something bigger, something more dangerous. He pulled out his laptop and began reviewing the day's updates, determined to stay ahead of whatever was coming. But as he worked, another notification appeared on his phone. A second message from the unknown number. "You made a mistake, Miller. It's time to pay the price." Alex felt a chill run through him. This was no longer just a vague threat. Richard had turned his focus squarely on him. He picked up his phone and dialed Margaret. "We need to talk," he said as soon as she answered. "I just got another message." "What does it say?" Margaret asked, her voice calm but urgent. "He's coming after me," Alex replied. "And I think he means it." Margaret's voice hardened. "We'll deal with it, Alex. Meet me at the office first thing. Whatever Richard has planned, we'll be ready." As Alex ended the call, he knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't going to let Richard win. Alex was reviewing his notes for an important meeting when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Margaret. "Come to my office immediately." He felt a flicker of unease. Margaret rarely sounded this urgent. Gathering his things, he made his way to her office. When he entered, he found her standing by the window holding a letter in her hand. Her expression was grave, her usual composure replaced by a tension that Alex hadn't seen before. "Margaret," Alex said, closing the door behind him. "What's going on?" Without a word, Margaret handed him the letter. Alex took it, his brow furrowing as he scanned the first few lines. It was a legal notice, a lawsuit filed by Richard Thompson against TechWave, but as he read further, his breath caught. Richard wasn't just suing the company. He had included a series of documents that exposed a secret from Margaret's past, something buried deep in the early days of TechWave's founding. "What is this?" Alex asked, his voice a mix of confusion and concern. Margaret turned to face him, her expression heavy with regret. "Keep reading," she said quietly. Alex continued, his grip tightening as he read the allegations. The documents claimed that years ago Margaret had been involved in an incident that Richard was now framing as illegal activity, a supposed financial maneuver that had saved TechWave in its infancy, but, under scrutiny, could be twisted to appear unethical. When Alex finally finished, he looked up at Margaret, his voice low. "Is this true?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded slowly. "It's true," she said, her tone filled with pain. "But not in the way Richard is making it seem." "Then what really happened?" Alex pressed, his gaze steady. Margaret sat down, motioning for Alex to do the same. She took a deep breath before beginning. "When I founded TechWave," she said, "we were on the brink of collapse more times than I care to admit. There was one moment, a deal that would make or break us. I was desperate, and Richard was brought in as a consultant to help secure the funding." Alex listened intently as Margaret continued. "The deal wasn't illegal, but it wasn't clean either. Richard manipulated the numbers to make the company look more stable than it was. I didn't know at first, but when I found out, I let it slide. I told myself it was necessary to keep the company afloat." Her voice faltered, and she looked away. "It's the one decision I've regretted every day since. I swore I'd never let anything like that happen again." Alex leaned back, absorbing her words. "And now Richard's using it against you," he said. "He's trying to destroy your reputation, and the company's, with this." Margaret nodded, her gaze hardening. "He's framing it as if I orchestrated the entire thing, as if I've been corrupt from the beginning. And with his resources and allies, he'll make it convincing." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Alex leaned forward, his tone resolute. "Margaret, we've come too far to let him win now. We'll fight this. Together." Her eyes softened, a flicker of hope breaking through her worry. "You're sure?" Alex gave a small smile. "You've trusted me this far. I'm not backing down now." That afternoon, Alex gathered the team, Sarah, Emily, and Michael, and explained the situation. The room fell silent as they processed the weight of Richard's latest move. "He's not just coming for the company," Sarah said finally. "He's coming for Margaret personally." Emily's jaw tightened. "We can't let him do this. If he takes Margaret down, it'll cast doubt on everything we've accomplished." Michael, always pragmatic, tapped his laptop. "We need to discredit his evidence. If we can prove the context of the deal and show Margaret's actions in the right light, it'll weaken his case." Alex nodded. "Exactly. Margaret made a tough call, but it wasn't criminal. We need to find proof of that. Emails, documents, anything that shows Richard's role in manipulating the deal." Sarah leaned forward. "What about character witnesses? People who worked with Margaret back then, who can speak to her integrity?" "That's a good idea," Alex said. "We'll need every angle we can get." The next few days were a blur of activity. The team worked around the clock, digging through old archives, interviewing former employees, and consulting with legal experts. Margaret, meanwhile, prepared to address the board once again, knowing that their support would be crucial in the coming battle. Late one evening, as Alex was reviewing a stack of old financial records, his phone buzzed with another anonymous message. "You can't save her. You're wasting your time." He stared at the screen, his resolve hardening. Without hesitation, he forwarded the message to Margaret and added a single note: "Let them come." The day of the hearing arrived. Margaret stood before the board, Alex and the team at her side. Richard's legal team presented their case, painting a damning picture of Margaret's early decision and portraying her as the architect of a fraudulent scheme. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Yes, I made a mistake," she said. "I allowed something to happen that I shouldn't have. But I did it to save this company. Not for personal gain, but because I believed in what TechWave could become." She gestured to Alex and the team. "And everything we've done since then proves that this company stands for integrity and innovation. Richard Thompson's actions are the real threat to TechWave, not a decision I made under duress over a decade ago." Alex presented their evidence next. Records showing Richard's manipulation of the deal, statements from former employees corroborating Margaret's account, and a detailed timeline that exposed Richard's long-standing pattern of deceit. By the time they finished, the room was silent. The board deliberated for hours before finally delivering their decision. Richard's lawsuit was dismissed, and a counter-investigation was launched into his actions. As the news spread, Margaret turned to Alex and the team, her expression a mix of relief and gratitude. "You didn't just save the company," she said. "You saved me." Alex smiled. "We saved each other." Though the battle with Richard had ended, its impact lingered. But TechWave emerged stronger, its foundation rebuilt on the strength of truth and resilience. And as Alex looked around at the people who had become his family, he knew they were ready for whatever came next. The shadow of Richard Thompson had been vanquished, but the light they'd found together would guide them forward.
If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.